Hello, comic creators. Welcome to the post Halloween episode of the Business of Comics podcast. As always, I'm going to start off with the news of the past couple weeks in the industry. We're going to do a little op ed piece, and then we're going to open up the floor to everybody's questions. So, if you'd like to ask a question, please type it in to the comments box, and I will get to it in the order in which it was received. Now, as we've noted before, this is not going to be legal advice. So keep that in mind when you're asking your questions. The first big piece of news that we have for the week is that WB is looking for a new buyer. Warner Brothers, the mega corporation that owns DC, is looking to move on from Discovery after they moved on from AT&T, after they moved on from whoever else that owned them prior to that acquisition. Now, the vast majority of that deal is way beyond the scope of comics in that it's going to impact legacy media, film, television, video games, and emerging technology like AI. But what comic creators do need to understand, especially in the emerging and independent space, is that as consolidation increases and new voices might struggle to find a home, it might be even more important to cultivate your personal perspective in the work that you're doing and to find the true fans who are looking for more than just corporate entertainment. Yes, there is a place for the tentpole superhero film, but there's also going to be a place for the type of perspective that you have that is going to be harder and harder to find a place if, let's say, Netflix buys Warner Brothers. The next major story is a continuation of something that we started talking about back when we relaunched this channel, and that is the area of digital comics as a distribution channel is continuing to expand. The past couple of weeks, a French company launched a comic book app in the United States called Bang. And at the same time, Dark Horse is moving further into their dealings with Webtoon. Yen Press is now publishing on Tapas, and Tokyo Pop is publishing on something called Manga Plaza. Now, if you remember from the last couple weeks, we had DC and Marvel both going day and date with Global Comics, and Crunchyroll and Mad Cave launching their own digital comics app on both iOS and Android. Now, even with all of these moves into the digital space, comics still lags behind media like music, film, and games in terms of digital distribution. But if you're a comic book creator, if you're a comic book publisher, and you're also looking to get into the digital space, you have to figure out which app gives you the best chance to generate revenue. Because the upside of digital distribution is it is faster, it is cheaper, it is easier to reach a large number of people with very little effort. But at the same time, generating revenue from digital distribution is a challenge that a lot of companies, even something like Webtoon, that already did their IPO and went public, is struggling to turn a profit, even though they're getting substantial number of eyeballs on all of their content. Speaking of distribution, we are also going to look at an op-ed piece that was published in Comics Beat. A very prominent retailer out on the West Coast published this op-ed piece discussing how the Diamond bankruptcy has impacted comic book shops and their ability to buy indie comics. You can find this story on Comics Beat. It was published the last, I guess, 48 hours. But the basic concept is that the idea of non-refundable indie comics do not generate enough revenue on their own to justify national print distribution if major publishers are not distributed in the same system. So back before the Diamond bankruptcy, a comic book shop could get all of their comics from one source. They can get DC Comics, Marvel Comics, Image Comics, and all of the indie comics, they would just have to order through previews. Now, that system justified because the main players, the Marvels, the DCs, the Images, the Valiants, whoever, was generating enough revenue from what they were doing to make so it made sense for Diamond to actually go in and kind of pick up the distribution of a lot of independent publishers who don't publish frequently enough or who don't have the sales numbers enough to justify the staff, the warehouse space, the shipping, the just the production cost itself to run that kind of distribution. It also made sense for comic book shops to take a risk on those independent books because keep in mind, if you're buying a book that's non-returnable, you're taking a gamble on every book that you buy because you're betting that the book you buy, you're going to be able to sell to someone else. If the comic book shops are in a situation where it doesn't make sense to take a risk on an independent book, and it doesn't make sense for a distributor like Lunar to try to handle all of these different independent titles because they don't have the staff, they don't have the capacity to kind of fold it underneath all of the distribution from the majors that they have, independents are running into a situation where it's going to be very difficult for them to find distribution into the direct market. So, as we've actually discussed in previous episodes, the concept that you need to ask as a independent comic book publisher is threefold. One, does your comic book belong in comic book shops in the first place? Not every comic belongs in a comic book shop. And if your audience doesn't go to comic book shops, then you don't need to have your book there. And then this isn't a problem. But if your audience does go to comic book shops, do you have a way to offer your comics to the shops in a way that makes financial sense for you, for the comic book shop itself, and for any distributor that's going to be handling that process? The way your books are priced, the terms under which your books are bought, are they set up in such a way to incentivize a comic book shop to buy them? And if they're not, what happens to your business model if you can't get your book into comic book shops? There are quite a few publishers who their main source of revenue is a direct market, but they're not Image, they're not Dark Horse or IDW. So they're not publishing on a consistent basis. So they may find themselves frozen out of that space. If you're frozen out of that space, can you pivot? Can you pivot to crowdfunding or bookstores or libraries or direct to consumer or digital? And if you can't, what does that do to your business? It is a very important question to ask because it doesn't make sense to make a comic that you cannot realistically get in front of the people that you want to read it. So now we're going to move into the op-ed piece of the show. After that, we're going to move into questions. So if you have any questions, please feel free to leave them in the comments, and I will get to them as soon as I finish my rambling. The rambling today is covering the basic idea that your comics, in most cases, are going to be an investment and not a job. What do I mean by that? Well, basically, a job is regular work that a person does to make money. An investment is actually defined as allocating resources to a project with the expectation of generating a return or profit over time. Now, we talked about this in the last episode, that it is a challenge to have a full-time job in comics because the work and the income don't necessarily come in on a regular basis. Number two, most comic book projects don't generate enough profit for you to live on. And number three is many comics do not make a upfront profit at all. But on the other hand, if you look at comics as an investment, take this example. You spend $10,000 to publish a comic, and the comic over time makes $12,000. That gives you a 20% return on your investment. Now, by way of comparison, if you took that same $10,000 and put it into the S&P 500, you invested in stocks, over a 5-year period, you would have had a return on investment of about 15%. So not only is making a comic as an investment in this scenario more profitable than putting it into the market, you actually also get the benefits of making a comic, which we will talk about in a little bit. So, this alternative perspective, though, isn't really about deciding where to put your money. It is designed to help you reframe your relationship with your comic. So, if you see your comic as an investment, you're not putting unrealistic pressure on yourself to make a living from comics. In the same way, someone who has a 401k or buys an investment property doesn't quit their job and struggle to make a living off of their investment because it's an investment. It's not supposed to pay your bills on a day to day basis. If you see your comic as an investment, you are willing to give the process more time because investments, in many cases, are kept for the long term. And you know that you might not see results for 5, 10, or 20 years out. But if you're not seeing it as your day to day job and you're seeing it as an investment, then that process becomes much more palatable. Your risk of loss actually increases. If you see your comic as an investment, you're open to the idea of a media crossover and merchandise and other opportunities, but you're not desperate to get a movie deal because you're not expecting this comic to pay your bills in the short term. The other idea is if you see your comic as an investment, you are going to be more aware of all the non-financial benefits of the project. Because, like I said before, you're not just investing money, you are investing in your own intellectual, creative, and social growth as well. It may not necessarily be helpful for your sleep. It may not necessarily be helpful for you physically because making comics is not really the greatest physical activity in the world, but there are still benefits that go beyond the financial. And finally, if you see your comic book as an investment, then you're more likely to put in the right amount of time and energy relative to the rest of your life, rather than trying to put in full-time hours into something that's really only giving you a part-time income. Now, all this isn't to say that some people can't turn their comic book activity into a full-time job. There are freelance creators who are doing it. There are Webtoons creators who are doing it. And even some crowd-based publishers who are clients of mine live off of the revenue from their comic. But just because your comic doesn't pay for your life right now does not mean that it's not worth your time and energy. So now that the rant is over, we will open up the floor to any questions that anybody has. Well, looks like it's going to be a slow day today because everybody's recovering from Halloween. So we're going to wrap the show right there. Thank you, everybody, for tuning in. If you have questions that you want to ask between now and the next episode of the show, please feel free to drop those questions in Facebook, TikTok, Instagram, or you could send me a direct message and we can get to the question in the next show. If you are looking to actually start your own publishing company, please consider purchasing the Business of Independent Comic Book Publishing. It's available wherever you buy books. If you would like to start a career as a freelance comic book creator, please check out the Business of Freelance Comic Book Publishing. If you have specific questions or you know you're at the point where you need legal representation for your comics, please reach out to me at GamalHennessy.com to schedule a free consultation. The next episode of the Business of Comics podcast is going to take place on Saturday, November 15th at 3 p.m. So until then, get off the internet and have fun with your comics.